Now for the stomach, we do need to talk about several cell types. There's 5 cell types that are going to be important for you to recognize. And I have some pretty useful mnemonics to help you. So here's the 5 cell types. Let's go in these in order. Our parietal cells are located in the body and the fundus. Just for what it's worth, I don't think the locations of these cells are as important as the functionality. You will need to know the location on a histologic slide, which I'll go over later, but I just wanted to be comprehensive. So the parietal cells basically located in a significant portion of your stomach, and their function is to secrete HCl and intrinsic factor. And my mnemonic for parietal cells is that they're very parite, like polite. And I say this because there's 2 reasons why I have this mnemonic. First off, they like to say hi. They're very polite, so they always say hi. And that reminds me that the 2 compounds that parietal cells secrete are HCl and intrinsic factor. And later, when we talk about histologic slides, we'll notice that they're the first glandular cell. They're in the upper glandular layer. So they're very polite because they're the first gland to greet anything that's coming into the system. Let's talk about chief cells now. They're also located in the body and the fundus. And the chief cell's function is to secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase, which are both helpful for enzymatic breakdown. And so I think of chief cells as our chomp cells because they break down stuff. And our mucous cells are pretty easy to understand. They're located throughout the stomach. And as you'd expect, they would produce mucus, and they also produce bicarb. So they basically counteract the acidic environment that our body tends to produce in our stomach. I don't have a mnemonic for that because that's pretty self-explanatory. Next, we have our G cells, which are located a little bit more distally in the pyloric antrum and then throughout the duodenum. And our G cells are responsible for secreting gastrin. And I remember our G cells are gas cells because of gastrin. And we'll find out that gastrin is the gas pedal for our stomach. It can help us produce a lot of hydrogen ions and make it a more acidic environment. So that's why the G cells I consider are gas cells. The last cell I want to talk about are D cells. They're also located pretty distal in the pyloric canal and throughout the duodenum. And these cells secrete somatostatin. And I always remember somatostatin as somatostopin because it turns off everything, okay? And so my D cells are decreased cells because they produce this hormone that basically shuts every other hormone down. So now that we have a little bit of an idea of where these cells exist and a little bit of basic idea of what their function is, we're going to spend a lot more time going over their physiology. So mucous cells, again, it's quite basic. They produce mucus and bicarb, which protects us against our acidic environment. And what we'll talk about later is that if you have deficient mucus production, you can get acute gastritis. And on the other hand, if you have too much mucus production, you can get a disease called Menetrier's disease. Moving on to parietal cells, because they do 2 different functions, we're going to have to go into each of these functions in pretty great detail here. So we've talked about this. If you don't know this by now, I don't know what we're going to have to do. You'll learn it by the end of the lecture that parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. And here's my mnemonic again, just for your own reference. And a pathology we have to think about is pernicious anemia, chronic autoimmune gastritis. Chief cells are pretty straightforward. They're in the lower glandular layer, and they get secreted through these gastric pits. And remember, they're our chomp cells. So they're going to secrete pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is a zymogen, which can be cleaved into pepsin in the presence of acid. And then that pepsin can go and try to digest proteins. We also have gastric lipase here that can help break down fats. But just as a reminder, the pancreatic lipase, which we'll talk about in the pancreas section, is more important for breaking down fats. And again, the mnemonic is chomp cells, as you know. Now let's talk about our G cells. So these G cells secrete gastrin, and they provide the gas for the stomach. And why we say they provide the gas is because they really do increase the functionality of our stomach. They can increase the hydrogen ion secretion, they can increase our gastric motility, and they can increase the gastric mucosa growth. We've already seen how gastrin increases hydrogen ion secretion earlier. When we're talking about here, we can see that our G cells and gastrin right here, they can help perpetuate all this. I'm going to go back. They can help through either of these pathways. They can help increase hydrogen ion secretion in the long run. And so how is gastrin regulated? You don't want this gastrin to just be going out of off the charts here, because then you'll have a problem of too much hydrogen ion secretion. And the reverse might be true too. You need a nice balance. So how it works is that you can have decreased release in acidic environments, which makes sense. If it's already acidic, you don't need gastrin to produce more acid. And then you increase the release in basic environments. So all this seems very, it makes sense from a homeostasis perspective. Now, what causes the basic environment? Well, when you eat food, that acidic stomach kind of gets neutralized by all your food products. So in the setting of once you eat food, it's good to have more gastrin release. That's a physiologic adaptation. If your vagus nerve gets stimulated, that can also increase gastrin release. You can have, which we've already seen, the vagal nerve through the GRP pathway. If you have PPIs or any antacids that prevents the acid from being secreted, that'll give you a more basic environment. So gastrin will start working harder. And then we'll talk about this later in chronic gastritis. If your parietal cells are dying and you don't have anything producing the hydrogen ions, then you're gonna get G cell hyperplasia and excessive gastrin release. And pathologies to look out for, think about something called a gastrinoma, which is a gastrin secreting tumor that's going to cause something called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, which we'll talk about later. The last cell type I want to go over are D cells. And D cells, they are decreased cells and they produce somatostatin. So somatostatin is what I've been referring to as somatostatin. This decreases everything, decreases our gastric acid secretion, pepsinogen secretion, decreases our pancreatic and small intestinal fluid secretions, decreases glucagon, decreases insulin, decreases our gallbladder contraction. It turns everything off, okay? And so, and again, we've already seen somatostatin work its magic when we were looking at our inhibitors here. You could see somatostatin was one of those inhibitors that could ultimately decrease hydrogen ion secretion through this GI coupled pathway. And some pathologies to look out for. All you have to know is that there's something called a somatostatinoma, which is a pancreatic islet cell tumor. This is from our pancreas lecture where I go into all the islet cell tumors. And I just wanted to point out that if you look at the symptoms, all the symptoms are completely related to having turned off the hormones themselves, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content.